So here you are, sitting in your chair or watching this talk on screen, wondering about what you're going to do with your life, how you're going to spend your time, your talent, your love, how you're going to build a life and a career worth those three precious resources. It's tough. It's intimidating. It's overwhelming sometimes. Where do you go? What path do you choose? How do I find what's right for me? It's also lonely. But the good news is, you're not alone. Because you see, there are 7.5 billion other people in the world who either are or will be asking and struggling with the same questions that you are. Now, all of us face a choice about where we want to live our lives, where we want to build our careers. Do we want to build them in the world that we know, where everything seems to be common wisdom and all the assumptions are proven, period? Or where the facts maybe aren't too available, but people substitute for absolutist beliefs that claim that this is the way the world has to be. So you can live on that side of the status quo. Or you might choose to move into a different world, a world that might be, a world that hasn't been explored yet, a world of discovery, of challenging assumptions, of experimentation, looking for new ideas and new insights. The status quo has a lot going for it. In fact, some people believe we're actually wired physiologically to prefer the status quo. And it's pretty great because you don't have to worry about changing it too much. It kind of stays where it is. And it's tough to change. It's tough to change ourselves. I mean, just imagine, we're entering the New Year's resolution time. If you happen to practice that ritual of giving yourself New Year's resolutions, be prepared, because 60 to 90% of them fail within the first 6 weeks or 6 months. So it's tough to change even ourselves. But the great thing about the status quo is that it's really terrific if it's us that has the status. But the rest of the world and the planet that we depend upon isn't doing so well by the status quo. In fact, you might say that they're living in the status quo. We're already doing our best job of making our planet increasingly uninhabitable for us as human beings and for the plants and animals that also depend on our Earth. That's bad enough. But take a look at how we divide the pie of resources in the world. Let me give you just a quick rough picture of how income in the world is separated by quintile of the population. And it looks something like this. The top 20% have about 70% of the income. In fact, the top 1% earn more than the bottom 1/2 of those 7.5 billion people that I talked about earlier. Now, economists have looked at this chart, and they've said, that's the champagne glass view of income distribution. I look at that chart, and I see something a little different. I see something that basically says it's the top of the pyramid that gets to pop the cork and drink the wonderful wine, while the other 4/5 of humanity feel like they're getting screwed. Now, it's not just the bottom of the pyramid who feels badly about this, because after all, 1 in 7 people lack access to electricity. 1 in 4 people don't have safe drinking water in their homes. 1 in 3 people don't have access to even the most basic sanitation resources. But even for those people who have jobs, up and down the pyramid, across the world, Gallup tells us that 85% of those folks are either dissatisfied or not engaged at all in the work that they do. And that's where they spend most of their time, most of that time and talent that I talked about earlier. What a waste. What a waste. So what do we do? Particularly if we're stuck in a large organization, far away from where the decision-making happens. How is it that it's possible for us to think about changing the status quo? Because when we think about change, it feels pretty isolating, pretty alone. It's tough to get attention. It's tough to decide where to go, what to do. So, again, maybe we just throw up the white flag. Maybe we say, hey, that's enough. I'll kind of roll with the flow here. I don't want to change it. It's too much of a headache. I'll keep doing what I'm doing, what I'm already doing. Thank you very much. Or maybe I'll spend my day playing video games or surfing the web. But it comes back to this choice again. Do I want to build my life in the world that is, or the world that people say must be, or do I want to explore the world that might be? Now, how is it that so many of us get stuck in one when we know the other world might be so much better? And it occurred to me as I was thinking about this that there's a barrier between the what is and the what might be. And I decided it needed a name, so I called it the now barrier. And the fact of the matter is that probably many people in the world live their lives, build their careers on the left side of the now barrier. So they needed a name too, and I decided to call them Biders, because they're biding their time. They're waiting for change to happen, but they're not really doing much to affect it. Now, occasionally, Biders will push up against the boundary of the status quo. And maybe even once in a while, they might actually go further than that and make a dent in the status quo. But the barrier is there to be broken, like the sound barrier, like the 4-minute mile barrier. It can be broken. If you get through that now barrier, you might become a builder. Now, what is it that builders do? They challenge the status quo. They try to do things that haven't been done before. Now, it's not just entrepreneurs that do this. There are all kinds of people that are builders in the arts, in science, in the humanities, up and down the organization charts. It doesn't matter what title you have, doesn't matter what job you're in, what industry you're in, what country you're in. You have the capability of becoming a builder, of breaking through that now barrier. But I'm going to focus specifically on entrepreneurs. Why? Because entrepreneurs create, propel, drive the economies that most of us depend upon. They create the jobs that most of us have. They propel innovation. And not just that, but hundreds of millions of people in the world have to be entrepreneurs in order to feed themselves, in order to put clothes on their kids, in order to send their kids to school. They have no choice. Other tens of millions of people work with entrepreneurs around the world. Entrepreneurs create opportunity. But it's not just people that are actively doing entrepreneurship now. There are a lot of people who are curious about entrepreneurship, who think that maybe at some time they might like to try it. And in fact, most of us in our life, at some point or another, are going to have to think like and act like, maybe be like, entrepreneurs, even though that may not be a title that you think about for yourself. So the builder has a challenge. And the challenges of most builders are more or less the same, even though the vocabulary might change. In the case of entrepreneurs who are building businesses, there are basically 5 challenges. But think about that in your own mind when you think about an idea that changes the status quo. First, it's all about the value that you're going to create. Presumably, value means you are better than the status quo. Your idea, your solution is better than the status quo. So you've got to come up with an idea that is a solution to some problem or some need that you've identified. Second, there is no such word, at least in the English vocabulary, called solopreneurship. It's entrepreneurship. So you need a team. You need one person, 2 people, a team of other people helping you make this idea a reality. You probably are going to need people to buy or to use or to accept whatever it is you're proposing. You need the equivalent of customers. And unless you happen to be independently wealthy, or maybe one of those absolute top 1% people that I talked about earlier, you probably are going to need some sponsors. You're going to need some people who give you, lend you, invest in your idea to help you make it possible. And finally, if that all goes well, you would love to be able to scale this idea. So you can do more for more people. You can go into more markets, help more people, sell more products, whatever it may be. So how do you make sense out of all those individual pieces? Well, that's the magic of entrepreneurship. And the beauty of what entrepreneurs do is they've figured out how to connect these different and disparate resources into something that is capable of generating and creating value. The definition of entrepreneurship I borrow and adapt from a professor at Harvard Business School named Howard Stevenson. And it goes something like this. Entrepreneurship is the pursuit and creation of opportunity beyond the resources you control. Now think of that for a moment. That's a very broad definition. That applies to almost any builder who's trying to change the status quo. But what's interesting here is that there is one unique resource that is within your control, that has the ability to improve the odds of your success in what is a pretty daunting endeavor to try to change the status quo. And that resource is you. Your personality, how you make decisions, how you do what you do. And this is a topic that my Princeton colleague and close friend Chris Keeney and I got very interested in. We wanted to understand, amidst all of the resources and all of the books about how to entrepreneurship and why be an entrepreneur, we wanted to tackle what we saw as the central mystery of entrepreneurship and look at the personality characteristics of highly successful entrepreneurs. So that's what we set out to do. We viewed in entrepreneurship somewhat as a marathon, and we didn't want to look at every aspect of this marathon. We took a look at bystanders and we decided, no, as interesting as they are, that's not what we wanted to focus on. We also didn't want to focus on who we call the wantrepreneurs, people who are thinking about, might consider it at some point, but are not yet doing entrepreneurship. We leave those for other people. And we also are not that interested in doing a book or research on the people who are actually in the race itself, the runners in the race, the entrepreneurs who are actually in the market. They're fascinating. They're amazing people. But that's not where we decided to focus. We wanted to focus our research and our book on people who won that marathon. People who had created highly successful businesses that have stood the test of both time and scale. The builders of businesses that had lasted and generated enormous value. So, how is it that those people, those women and men, are built? What's their personality like? And do you have to be somewhat superhuman to be able to do what they've done? Those are the kinds of questions that we asked ourselves. But we asked them 4 basic questions. 1, how are they motivated? What is it that got them up in the morning? What made them want to become entrepreneurs? 2nd, how do they make decisions? 3rd, how do they manage people? And 4th, how do they lead organizations? And we wanted not just to ask them, but we wanted to create an instrument that might ask another question, which is, how might you be wired for growth? Now, we started with 100+ questions, going out to over 1,000 of those highly successful entrepreneurs I talked about. We were able, using a patented and proven methodology that Chris and his team at an earlier venture had created, to boil down those gazillion statistics into 4 patterns of personality and 10 questions that after the TED Talk, or maybe when you're on a break, if you're so interested, you can go on the website and take the quiz yourself. It'll take you a few minutes, but it'll give you an idea of how you might be like one of these types that I'm going to talk to you about. What are the types? Well, the quartet begins with drivers. 2nd, with explorers. 3rd, crusaders. And 4th, captains. And let me see if I can give you a little bit more of a sense of what makes these folks different. Remember, there's no one path here. There's no one type of personality. You don't need to be like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos or an Oprah Winfrey. You have an option to basically pick somebody who is more like you than one of those people might be, and then learn from how they do what they do. Because each of these builder personalities has created enormous success. Now, drivers. Drivers are intense people, really intense. They are fixated on their particular product. So much so that sometimes Chris and I would call them product narcissists. These people, if they're hearing ringing in their ears, chances are it's the ringing of a cash register. They knew early on that they wanted to be an entrepreneur. And they are extremely, supremely confident people. Great for tenacity, great for single-minded focus and intensity, but sometimes difficult to work with and difficult to work for. Anybody come to mind? Oh, maybe somebody like this. Now, these are icons of these types of personalities, archetypes. But you don't have to be these people. There are lots of other folks like this, millions of other entrepreneurs around the world who share critical characteristics with those iconic people. Ben Weiss, who created a beverage company out of coffee ground waste. Steve Brightman, who created a chain of cash laundries in New York City apartments. Now, second, explorers. If drivers are fixated by product, explorers are fascinated by puzzles. They love complicated challenges. These people tend to be extraordinarily curious, and they are very much systems thinkers. They like to figure out what's the picture on the box top of those puzzle pieces that are confusing people. But they also tend to be somewhat dispassionate in how they lead and manage. They can tend to look at the people around them almost as if they're factors in an equation or cogs in some design. And it's tough sometimes for them to have the more human touch. Now, Sarah Blakely would be a good example of an explorer. She started off by answering one basic question: why are pantyhose made the way they are? And out of trying to solve that particular puzzle, built an enormously successful company called Spanx. But she's not alone. Brian O'Kelly created one of the great engines of ad auctioning behind the web called AppNexus. Or Mark Bonfili figured out how to take car dealerships and move them online. Third, you might be a crusader. Now, crusaders, unlike the other two people, crusaders tend to be also extraordinarily bold, thinking about the long term. They are very much inspired by mission, and they tend to be quite compassionate. In fact, so compassionate sometimes that they can confuse agreement with their vision with the need for supervision. And that's something that Ben and Jerry told us when we interviewed them for our book. But it's not just the Ben and Jerrys of the world. It's people like Jenny Fleiss, who is the co-creator of Rent the Runway. Or it's somebody like Nate Morris, who is basically bringing the Uber business model to solid waste disposal in the United States. So rounding out the quartet are captains. Now, what is it that makes captains so unique? Captains, unlike the other three people, tend to manage and lead around the we rather than the me. They tend to be very pragmatic. They're very much focused and inspired and intrigued by what a team can do, but they're also very direct and accountable. Who might be an example? Well, Jack Ma, the builder of Alibaba, is a good example. His motto when he started Alibaba was employees first, customers second, investors third. But again, he's not alone. Mark Coopersmith's a guy that basically took Sony into the world of electronic finance early on. Or maybe it's Marjorie Krauss, who built the second largest privately held PR firm in the world. So we talked about the builder's challenges, these 5 things that you have to do: the solution, the team, investors, customers, and ultimately scale. How do you do that? Well, maybe you apply something that Chris and I called 3 Gs. First, you focus on lifting your own gifts. Those gifts come also with some gaps. Mind the gaps. But ultimately, frame the game that plays to that mix of gifts and gaps that you might have or your boss may have. Frame the game. If you are a driver, if you are an explorer, or a crusader, or a captain, maybe you decide to be the best one of those you possibly can be. Or maybe you decide that there's something to be learned from your counterparts. Chris and I came up with this idea of polar complements. Explorers and crusaders, for example, would be a polar complement. Crusaders have a great time and great asset in giving people a sense of mission and purpose. That's a tough thing for explorers, but explorers have the kind of detail focus and implementation focus that sometimes eludes crusaders. Now, however you decide, however and wherever you decide to build your career or build your life, the central proposition is that who you are shapes how you will build. You're still alone. You're still an individual. But you're a unique individual. Nobody has ever lived your life, and nobody ever will. So even if you never watch another TED Talk, or listen to another podcast, or read another book, you might go back in time and just recall some very simple wisdom from Socrates 2,000 years ago. Know thyself. Chris and I had the audacity to suggest a slight amendment: know and apply yourself. And if that doesn't work for you, I want you to remember one other thing. Oscar Wilde had it best. Be yourself. Everyone else is taken. Thanks very much.